The crystal spires of Arum Prime touched the heavens like fingers reaching for the stars themselves. And on this day, they shone brighter than ever before in the recorded history of the Valori hegemony. 900 years had passed since the first Valori emperor united the warring clans and began the great expansion across the galaxy. And now his descendant Thesanix sat upon the eternal throne as living proof that his species was destined to rule all of creation. The celebration filled every corner of the palace world, and representatives from 100 vassal species had traveled across 40,000 star systems to pay tribute to their masters, the Pitiesta. Valori themselves moved through the crowds like living sculptures of light and crystal, their semi-transparent bodies refracting the ceremonial lights into rainbows that danced across marble floors. And they accepted the worship of lesser beings as their natural right. God Emperor Thesanix watched from his elevated throne as alien diplomats prostrated themselves before him. And he felt nothing but mild satisfaction at the display. His species had earned this power through 9 centuries of conquest, and every rival empire had fallen before Valori might, and every rebellion had been crushed beneath Valori boots, and every threat had been absorbed into the ever-growing hegemony. The Valori believed themselves to be the apex of galactic evolution, and nothing in their long history had ever given them reason to doubt this truth. In the great hall below the throne, Admiral Kesseth accepted congratulations from fellow officers as holographic displays showed the full extent of hegemony territory, and the map seemed to stretch forever in all directions. The Admiral had served for 200 years and had commanded fleets in dozens of campaigns, and he had personally overseen the subjugation of 17 species, and he considered himself a master of galactic warfare. A young officer approached him with a communication tablet, and Kesseth noticed the slight tremor in the subordinate's hands. The report was simple but strange, and it stated that 17 border monitoring stations had stopped transmitting over the past 6 hours, and there were no distress signals and no debris detected, and no explanation for the silence. Kesseth read the report twice and then dismissed it with a wave of his crystalline hand. And he told the young officer that sensor malfunctions were common in the outer reaches, and that maintenance crews would investigate after the celebration. The young officer bowed and retreated, but something cold had settled in his chest that he could not explain. Across the celebration hall, a human servant moved between the guests with a tray of drinks, and no one looked at him twice because humans were invisible in Valori society. 3 centuries ago, the hegemony had discovered a small blue world in a backwater spiral arm, and the creatures living there had possessed primitive technology and foolish courage. And they had actually attempted to resist when the cleansing fleet arrived. The Valori had found this amusing at first, and then annoying. And finally, they had simply glassed 3 continents until the survivors surrendered. The remaining humans had been scattered across labor worlds throughout the hegemony, and their culture had been erased, and their history had been forbidden. And within a generation, they had become just another servant species. Now they cleaned Valori homes and served Valori meals and maintained Valori ships. And they did so with quiet efficiency that their masters appreciated. And the Valori considered them useful, but utterly unremarkable. The human servant with the drink tray was named Marcus, and he had served in the imperial palace for 37 years. And in all that time, not a single Valori had ever asked his name or looked directly into his eyes. Marcus moved through the crowd and listened to conversations that the guests assumed he could not understand, and he memorized patrol schedules mentioned by boasting officers. And he noted the locations of security checkpoints revealed by careless guards. When his tray was empty, he returned to the service quarters, and there he found 11 other human servants waiting in silence. And they exchanged information with hand signals that the Valori had never thought to study. Somewhere in the depths of space beyond the hegemony's borders, something massive moved through the void without making a sound. And its hull was darker than the space around it, and no sensor in the known galaxy could detect its presence. The ship was not alone. And behind it came another, and another, and another, until the numbers became meaningless. They moved in perfect formation, without any communication that could be intercepted. And they had been traveling for a very long time. And they were patient because their crews had inherited patience from parents who had inherited it from grandparents who had survived the burning of Earth back on Arm Prime. The celebration continued into the night, and God Emperor Thizanish delivered a speech about the eternal glory of the Valori people. And the crowd cheered with genuine enthusiasm. The Emperor spoke of destiny and divine right and the natural order that placed his species above all others. And he spoke of the 1,000 years of prosperity that lay ahead. And he spoke of enemies that had been crushed and worlds that had been conquered, and future that belonged entirely to the hegemony. No one noticed the human servants standing in the shadows at the edges of the great hall. And no one saw the way they watched their masters with eyes that held no expression at all. Admiral Keseth received 3 more reports about silent stations before the night was over. And each time he dismissed the concerns and returned to the celebration. And each time the cold feeling in the young officer's chest grew stronger. The Admiral was not worried because he had commanded fleets that could crack planets and extinguish stars. And he served an empire that had stood for 900 years. And what could possibly threaten such power in the service quarters beneath the palace? Marcus sat alone in his small room and looked at a photograph that had been passed down through 4 generations of his family. And it showed a city on Earth before the burning. And in the photograph, children played in green parks beneath a blue sky. He touched the image gently and then hid it away in its secret place. And he spoke words that his great-grandmother had taught his grandmother, who had taught his mother, who had taught him. The words were simple, and they had been spoken by humans across the galaxy for 300 years. Always in whispers, always in secret, always with absolute faith that one day they would come true. "We remember," Marcus said to the empty room, "and we will return, and you will never see us coming." Outside the palace, the stars burned cold and distant, and somewhere among them, the silent fleet continued its approach. And the Valori hegemony celebrated 900 years of power without any understanding that its final night had already begun. 72 hours after the celebration ended, Counselor Myrith stood before a holographic map of hegemony space and watched another star system turn dark. She was considered the most brilliant strategic mind of her generation, and she had solved puzzles that had baffled entire war councils. And she had predicted enemy movements before the enemies themselves knew what they would do. But this problem made no sense to her at all. In 3 days, the hegemony had lost contact with 47 monitoring stations, 12 military outposts, and 7 colony worlds. And not a single distress signal had been received from any of them. Myrith had ordered scout ships to investigate the closest silent system. And what they found had disturbed her more than any battle report she had ever read. The colony world was intact, and its city still stood beneath a yellow sun, and the lights still glowed in buildings that lined empty streets, and the power plants still hummed with energy that served no one, but every Valori on the planet was gone, and there were no bodies and no signs of struggle and no indication of where 11 million people had disappeared. To the scouts had walked through homes where meals sat half-eaten on tables and through offices where documents lay scattered across desks and through schools where toys still waited for children who would never return. It was as if the entire population had simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Myrith requested military escorts for further investigations. But the reports from those missions were identical, and world after world presented the same impossible scene of structures without inhabitants and technology, without operators and silence without explanation. She began looking for patterns, because patterns were the key to every problem. And after 2 days of studying the data, she found something that made her blood run cold. Every vanished system had one thing in common, and it was not location or military value or economic importance. And it was the presence of significant human labor populations. Myrith ordered her staff to pull historical records from the archives, and she told them to find everything related to the human homeworld and the cleansing operation that had taken place 3 centuries ago. The official records were brief and dismissive, and they described a primitive species that had resisted hegemony expansion and had been appropriately punished. And they noted that survivors had been distributed across labor worlds as a productive resource. But Myrith dug deeper into classified files that required her council authority to access. And there she found a report that had been marked for suppression 290 years ago. The report came from Captain Vesson, who had commanded one of the final ships to leave Earth's system after the cleansing. And his words had been buried because they contradicted the official narrative of complete victory. Captain Vesson had written that the human resistance was far more organized than initial assessments had suggested, and that significant population centers had evacuated before orbital bombardment began, and that the final casualty estimates were based on assumptions rather than confirmed data. Most disturbing was his account of the final transmission, detected from Earth as his fleet departed. The humans had broadcast a message on every frequency simultaneously, and it had been short and clear and delivered in perfect Valori language. And it had said only this: "We remember, and we will return, and you will never see us coming." Captain Vesson had recommended a follow-up investigation to confirm the complete neutralization of human civilization. But his superiors had dismissed his concerns as paranoid, and the report had been classified and forgotten. Myrith read the document 3 times, and felt certainty growing in her mind like ice forming on still water. She tried to contact the God Emperor directly because this threat required immediate attention at the highest level. But the palace communication systems were experiencing unusual delays, and her requests were routed through bureaucratic channels that seemed designed to slow rather than help. She decided to go to the palace in person, and she gathered her security detail of 12 Valori soldiers and departed immediately. The journey from her offices to the Imperial Palace took 30 minutes by transport, and she used the time to organize her thoughts and prepare her presentation for the Emperor when she arrived. At the palace gates, she was met by a junior official who apologized profusely and explained that the Emperor was occupied with urgent matters and could not receive visitors. Myrith demanded to see someone with authority, and she was eventually directed to a waiting room where she was told a senior advisor would meet with her shortly. The waiting room was elegant and comfortable and staffed by human servants who moved silently along the walls and offered refreshments. That Myrith declined. She waited for 1 hour and then 2 and then 3, and her frustration grew with each passing minute, and she sent increasingly urgent messages to her contacts. In the military and the intelligence services, none of her messages received responses. Finally, she stood and announced to her security detail that they would find the Emperor themselves, and she strode toward the door that led deeper into the palace. The lights flickered once, and Myrith paused. And when the lights stabilized, she turned to give orders to her soldiers. The room behind her was empty. 12 armed Valori warriors had vanished without a sound, and the only people remaining were Myrith herself and a human servant standing near the far wall with a tray of drinks. Myrith's hand moved toward her sidearm. But she stopped when she saw the expression on the servant's face. He was smiling. And it was not the empty smile of a subordinate seeking to please a master. And it was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. "Who are you?" Myrith demanded. And her voice was steady despite the fear that had begun to climb up her spine. The human set down his tray and straightened to his full height. And Myrith realized that she had never really looked at a human before. And she had never noticed how they watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Thomas," the human said. "And my grandmother's grandmother survived the burning of Earth. And I have served in this palace for 40 years. And you have walked past me 1,007 times without ever seeing me." Myrith drew her weapon and aimed. It hit the human's chest. But her hands were trembling now because the impossible was happening around her, and she did not understand. "How? Where are my soldiers?" she demanded. Thomas smiled again and shook his head slowly. "They are learning what we learned 300 years ago," he said. "And they are learning that you cannot fight an enemy you cannot see. And they are learning that the Valkyrie are not as powerful as they believed." Myrith fired her weapon. But Thomas was no longer standing where he had been, and she had not seen him move. And when she turned, she found him standing behind her near the door. "We remember everything," Thomas said. And his voice was quiet and calm and absolutely certain. "And we have returned. And you never saw us coming." The lights flickered again. And when they stabilized, Myrith was alone in the room, and the palace was silent around her. And somewhere in the distance she could hear screaming. In a chamber that existed between dimensions, Admiral Sarah Chun stood before a tactical display that showed the entire Valori hegemony spread across 40,000 points of light. She was 67 years old, and her hair had turned gray in the service of humanity's longest mission. And she had trained her entire life for the night that was about to begin. Around her stood the command staff of the Liberation Fleet, and they represented every human settlement that had survived the scattering, and they carried the hopes of billions who had never stopped believing. This day would come the truth of humanity's survival was a story that had been passed down through generations in whispers and coded messages and secret gatherings that the Valori never suspected. When Earth burned 3 centuries ago, the Valori had declared victory too quickly, and they had not understood that humans were survivors. Above all else, evacuation ships had launched from hidden bases on the dark side of the moon, and from underwater facilities in Earth's deepest oceans, and from orbital stations that had been designed to look like debris. And millions of humans had escaped into the void while the Valori celebrated their conquest. Those refugees had scattered across the galaxy and had found hiding places in asteroid fields and on barren moons and in the spaces between stars where no one thought to look. They had built new lives in secret and had raised children who were taught 2 things above all else. Remember what was taken from you, and prepare for the day you will take it back. The humans who remained in Valori space as servants and slaves had not been abandoned, but rather had been given the most important mission of all. They became the eyes and ears of the resistance, and they memorized every detail of Valori military operations. And they mapped every patrol route and guard rotation. And they identified every weakness in an empire that believed itself invincible. The information flowed through networks that the Valori could not detect because they had never thought to look. And human servants passed messages through hand signals and hidden notes and genetic modifications that allowed them to communicate through bioluminescent patterns invisible to Valori eyes. 300 years of intelligence gathering had given humanity a complete picture of their enemy, and 300 years of secret development had given them the technology to exploit that knowledge. Admiral Chun looked at her tactical officer, and asked for the status. "Report one final time. All fleets are in position," the officer responded. "And we have confirmation from asset networks across all target systems. And phase shift drives are charged and synchronized. And we are ready to begin." The phase shift drive was humanity's greatest achievement. And it was technology that the Valori could not imagine because their scientific development had focused on weapons of destruction rather than tools of subtlety. Human ships equipped with phase shift drives could exist slightly out of alignment with normal space-time, and in this state, they were invisible to every sensor system known to exist. And they could pass through solid matter like ghosts moving through walls. The technology had been developed in secret laboratories hidden in dimensions that the Valori did not know existed, and it had been refined over generations until human ships could appear and disappear, at will with precision measured in microseconds. But the phase shift drive was only part of humanity's advantage, the liberation. Fleet numbered not in hundreds or thousands, but in millions. And the ships had been built in hidden shipyards across 3 centuries. And they ranged from massive dreadnoughts to tiny infiltration craft that could carry a single soldier into the heart of an enemy vessel. Every ship was crewed by volunteers who understood that this mission was the culmination of everything their ancestors had suffered for. And every soldier carried the names of family members who had died when Earthburned Admiral Chun had memorized her own list of names. And it included her great-great-grandmother, who had been a child in Tokyo when the Valori bombs fell. "Show me the human asset distribution," she ordered. And the display shifted to show glowing points scattered across every major Valori system. The hegemony had built their empire on human labor without ever considering the implications. And now human servants occupied positions in every level of Valori society. And they worked in military installations and government facilities and private homes of the most powerful families. These assets had spent their lives preparing for this moment. And they knew exactly what to do when the signal came. "The Emperor has mobilized his response fleet," the tactical officer reported. "And we are tracking 10,000 warships converging on Aurum Prime as expected." Chen nodded, because this was precisely what the plan required. The Valori were reacting to the disappearances with overwhelming force because they did not understand any other response. And they were gathering their most powerful weapons in one place because they believed strength of arms was the answer to every problem. "Let them see us," Chun ordered. Just for a moment, the tactical officer entered commands. And across the void of space surrounding Aurum Prime, the Liberation Fleet allowed itself to become visible on Valori sensors for exactly 3 seconds. The Valori tactical displays lit up with contact warnings, and officers across 10,000 ships stared at their screens in disbelief. And the numbers they saw were impossible. The human fleet was not an invasion force or a raiding party or anything the Valorian military doctrine had prepared. For it was an extinction-level event. Millions of ships surrounded the hegemony's capital in layers that stretched outward to the edge of the system. And each layer was composed of vessels that should not exist, built by a species that should have been broken, carrying warriors who should have forgotten their hatred generations ago. Then the contacts vanished as the human fleet shifted back out of phase, and the Valori were left staring at empty space where their doom had just announced itself. Admiral Chun watched the panic spread through the enemy fleet on her tactical display, and she felt no joy in what was about to happen because 300 years of hatred had burned away everything except cold determination. "Send the final signal to all assets," she ordered, "and begin the liberation across 40,000 systems." Human servants received the message they had waited their entire lives to hear, and they moved into positions that they had practiced in secret for decades. and they prepared to become the instruments of their people's vengeance. The God Emperor Thesan Ix stood in his throne room and demanded explanations from admirals who had none to give. And he threatened executions and torture and the destruction of worlds. And his rage filled the chamber with terrible sound. He did not notice the human servants standing motionless against the walls. And he did not see them exchange glances that carried more meaning than any Valori language could express. The long night was about to begin, and by morning, the galaxy would be forever changed. The Battle of Aurum Prime was not a battle at all, because a battle requires two sides capable of harming each other. And on this night, only one side could fight while the other could only die. The Valori fleet opened fire first, and 10,000 warships unleashed weapons that could crack moons and shatter asteroids. And the firepower directed at the human position would have devastated any conventional enemy, but the human fleet had already phased out of normal space. And the Valori weapons passed through empty void and struck nothing. And the most powerful military force in the hegemony's history had just announced its impotence to the universe. Admiral Kesseth stood on the bridge of his flagship and screamed orders at officers who could not obey them because the enemy existed in a state that Valori science could not explain. Find them, he demanded over and over. And his sensors showed nothing, and his weapons hit nothing. And his fleet was alone in the darkness between worlds. Then the first human ship phased back into reality, and it appeared inside the reactor core of a Valori dreadnought. And the massive warship exploded from within before anyone on board understood what had happened. More human vessels materialized throughout the Valori fleet, and some appeared just long enough to fire weapons that punched through shields from impossible angles. And others deposited boarding parties inside enemy ships before vanishing again. The Valori crews never saw their attackers, and they died fighting enemies that were already gone. And they fired at shadows that existed only in their terrified imaginations. Admiral Chung watched the destruction from her command center and felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. She had trained for this moment since childhood, and she had studied Valori tactics and psychology and military doctrine. And she had known exactly how they would respond to an enemy they could not comprehend. The Valori were warriors who believed in strength and honor and the glory of combat. And they had no framework for understanding an enemy that refused to engage on their terms. They expected their opponents to face them in open battle because that was what civilized species did. And the concept of a war fought entirely from the shadows was foreign to everything they believed. This was humanity's advantage. And it was not technology or numbers, but rather a different way of thinking about conflict itself. The Valori had taught humans that direct resistance was futile, and so humans had learned to resist indirectly. And they had become masters of patience and deception, and the kind of quiet determination that could wait 3 centuries for revenge. On Aurum Prime itself, the human servants had begun their own operations, and they moved through corridors. They had walked for decades with knowledge of every security system and patrol schedule and blind spot. Valori guards vanished from their posts, and military installations went dark, and communication networks collapsed as human technicians activated sabotage routines they had hidden in the systems years ago. God Emperor Thesan Ix stood in his throne room and watched his empire crumble on holographic displays that flickered and died one by one. His guards were gone, and his advisors had fled, and the servants he had never deigned to notice had revealed themselves as soldiers in an army he had never known existed. Human warriors materialized around the throne, and their weapons were trained on the emperor. But they did not fire, and they did not speak, and they simply stood in silent witness as the Valori ruler confronted his own helplessness. Then, the broadcasts began. Every communication channel in the hegemony carried the same transmission. And it was a human voice speaking in perfect Valori. And it was reciting names. The names were human names, and they belonged to the dead. And they had been collected over 3 centuries from records and memories and oral traditions that had preserved. Every lost soul, the voice spoke without pause or emotion. And it named the children who had died in Tokyo and London and Cairo and Mumbai. And it named the families who had been separated when Earth burned. And it named the workers who had died in Valori mines and factories and construction sites. The names went on for hours. And there were millions of them, and each one was a life that the Valori had ended or ruined. And each one was a debt that was now being collected. Decent X listened to the names and understood for the first time that his empire had not conquered humanity, but had merely awakened something that should have been left sleeping. A woman appeared before him, and she wore the uniform of a human admiral. And her face was hard with the kind of resolve that only generations of suffering could create. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. And her voice was calm and controlled and utterly without mercy. The emperor could only shake his head because words had failed him. "My name is Sarah Chun," she said. "And my great-great-grandmother was 7 years old when your ships came to Earth. And she hid in a basement while her city burned. And she watched her parents die through a crack in the rubble." The emperor tried to speak, but the admiral raised her hand and silenced him. "She survived," Chun continued. "And she had children who had children who had children, and every generation carried her memory. And every generation added their own suffering to the account." Chun gestured to the holographic displays that showed the destruction of the Valori fleet. And the images were almost too terrible to comprehend. 900 years to build, she said. And 1 night to destroy, and this is the price of what you took from us. The emperor finally found his voice and asked the only question that mattered to him: "What will you do with us now?" Admiral Chun looked at the broken ruler of a broken empire. And she saw not a monster, but merely a being who had never been taught that his species was not the center of the universe. "We will do what you never did for us," she said. "And we will give you a choice." The long night continued until dawn. And when the sun rose over Aurum Prime, it illuminated a galaxy that had been fundamentally transformed. The Valori hegemony was finished, and its military was destroyed, and its government had collapsed. And its emperor was a prisoner who had finally learned what it meant to be powerless, and across 40,000 worlds. Humans who had served in silence for 300 years finally stood in the light and spoke their names aloud. 1 month after the long night, the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened. The Valori hegemony had ruled for 900 years, and it had seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. And its destruction in a single night had shattered assumptions that 100 species had held as absolute truth. The great powers of the galaxy watched the humans with a mixture of terror and fascination, and they waited to see what the species that had just demonstrated the most devastating military capability in recorded history would do with its victory. They expected conquest because that was what powerful species did. They expected revenge because humanity had earned the right to it many times over. They expected the birth of a new empire built on the ruins of the old one. But the humans did something that no one anticipated. They went home. Admiral Chun stood before the assembled representatives of the former hegemony's vassal species, and she looked at beings who had spent centuries under Valori rule. And she understood their fear because she had once felt the same helplessness. "We did not come here to rule you," she said. And her words were broadcast across the galaxy. "And we did not fight for 300 years to become what we hated." She gestured to a holographic display that showed the territories of the former hegemony divided into dozens of independent regions. "These worlds belong to the species that live on them," she continued. And you will choose your own governments and write your own laws and build your own futures without human interference. The representatives stared at her in disbelief because this kind of generosity from a conqueror was unprecedented in galactic history. A Kalori diplomat who had served the hegemony for 200 years asked the question that everyone was thinking, why? He said simply, "Why would you give away such power when you have earned the right to claim it?" Chun smiled. And it was a tired smile that carried the weight of generations. "Because someone should have done it for us," she said. "And because we remember what it means to be at the mercy of those who see you as less than equal." The human fleet withdrew from hegemony space over the following weeks. And they took nothing except their own people. And they left behind only freedom and confusion and a galaxy that was no longer sure of anything. The Valori themselves were not destroyed or enslaved as they had expected. Instead, they were simply contained on their homeworlds and stripped of the technology they had used to oppress others. And they were left to build a new society from the ruins of their old one. Some humans argued for harsher punishment. And they remembered the burning of Earth and the generations of slavery and the countless deaths that the Valori had caused. And they demanded blood for blood. But Admiral Chun and the Liberation Council chose mercy. And they explained their reasoning to a species that had suffered more than any other. "If we kill them all," Chun said in her final address as Admiral, "we become them, and our children will inherit a legacy of genocide instead of a legacy of justice." She paused and looked at the crowd of humans who had gathered to hear her speak. "Our ancestors survived the burning of Earth because they were stronger than the fire that tried to consume them. And they built a resistance that lasted 3 centuries because they refused to surrender their humanity even when humanity was all they had left." Chun straightened her shoulders and spoke with conviction that came from the depths of her soul. "We will not dishonor that legacy by becoming the monsters we fought. And we will not teach our children that cruelty is acceptable when directed at enemies. And we will prove that humans can be powerful without being cruel." The Valari who heard these words did not know how to respond because their entire civilization had been built on the assumption that power existed to be used and that mercy was weakness. God Emperor Thesan IX spent his remaining years trying to understand how a species he had dismissed as primitive servants had developed technology beyond anything the hegemony had achieved and moral principles that seemed impossible for such a powerful people to maintain. He never succeeded. And he died in obscurity on a world that had once been the capital of everything. And history remembered him only as the last ruler of an empire that had fallen to the quiet ones on Earth itself, which had been restored over 3 centuries of secret terraforming and rebuilding. The first generation of humans who would never know what it meant to live in hiding was being born. They would grow up in cities that rose from the ashes of the old ones. And they would learn the history of their people, not as a story of victimhood, but as a testament to what determination and patience could accomplish. They would be taught the names of the dead, not so they would hate the Valori, but so they would understand the cost of tyranny and the value of freedom. An old woman named Elena tended a memorial garden in what had once been called Tokyo, and she planted flowers that her grandmother's grandmother had described from memories of a world before the burning. A young Valori diplomat approached her, and he was one of the first of his species permitted to visit Earth as part of the reconciliation process that the humans had initiated. He watched her work in silence for a long time before asking what the garden represented. Elena stood and wiped soil from her hands, and she looked at the crystalline being who would have been her master if history had gone differently. "It represents patience," she said, "and the things we refuse to forget, even when forgetting would have been easier." The diplomat nodded slowly and asked if she hated his people for what they had done. Elena considered the question carefully because it deserved an honest answer. I hated the Valori for a long time, she admitted, and that hatred kept me warm during cold nights and gave me strength when I wanted to give up. She paused and gestured to the garden around them. But hate is a fire that consumes everything if you let it burn too long. And my grandmother taught me that the goal was never revenge, but justice. And justice has been served. The diplomat did not fully understand her words, but he sensed their importance. And he bowed in the formal way of his people. "What do you want from the galaxy now?" he asked. "Now that you have proven your strength and your mercy." Elena smiled and returned to her planting. "We want what we always wanted," she said. "And it is nothing more complicated than this. To be left in peace. To remember our dead. To raise our children. And to never forget what happens when the quiet ones are pushed too far. Across the galaxy, other species watched humanity with new eyes. And they learned the lesson that the Valori had failed to understand. The humans were not conquerors or rulers or destroyers by nature. And they were simply survivors who wanted to live their lives in freedom. But they were also people who remembered everything. And they were people who could wait for generations. And they were people who would never be pushed into the darkness again without pushing back. The stars burned on as they always had, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. But the beings who lived beneath those stars had been forever changed by the night. When silent human fleets appeared and reminded the galaxy that the meek were not the same as the weak, and on Earth. In a garden that grew where bombs had once fallen, an old woman planted flowers and hummed a song that her grandmother had taught her. And the music drifted on the wind like a promise kept after 300 years of waiting.